She chose a stableman. Ravina's laughter cut through the ballroom like shattered crystal, while guests exchanged stunned glances beneath the flickering candlelight. Our eldest sister, daughter of a duke, leaving everything behind for a man who shovels hay. Lysara pressed her gloved fingers against her lips, barely containing her amusement. How delightfully tragic. Thessaly stood near the entrance hall of Haldron Court, clutching a single leather traveling case while rain drummed heavily against the stone walls outside. Dozens of noble faces stared back at her with varying shades of pity, disgust, and fascinated horror. Not one person in the room moved to defend her. Then Duke Morven Haldron slowly rose from his chair at the head of the long dining table. The ballroom fell dangerously quiet. "You were given everything," he said, his voice low enough to command absolute silence from every corner. Beauty. Education. The name of one of the finest families in England. His jaw tightened as his gaze settled upon his eldest daughter standing near the door. "And you chose to throw it all away for a servant." The word landed like a strike across the room. Several women gasped softly behind their painted fans. Ravina tilted her head with exaggerated sadness. "Perhaps she has simply lost her senses, father. Loneliness does peculiar things to a woman." More laughter rippled through the guests. Duchess Elaine closed her eyes briefly, her gloved hand pressed flat against the white tablecloth, trembling with barely controlled shame. Thessaly said nothing. She had rehearsed this moment so many times inside her mind that the cruelty no longer surprised her. Only the sheer scale of it still stung beneath her ribs. She turned toward the enormous front doors where the storm hammered steadily against the steps of the estate. Behind her, the silence was already filling with whispered judgments that would chase her name across every drawing room in England by morning. But before she reached the threshold, the sound of hooves and iron wheels grinding sharply against wet gravel echoed through the entrance hall. A carriage unlike anything the guests had ever seen rolled to a halt outside the estate. Black lacquered wood trimmed with silver filigree, 4 matching horses the color of midnight. And upon its doors, a crest so ancient and powerful that Lord Pemberton, seated near the tall windows, dropped his wine glass directly onto the marble floor. A liveried footman stepped down into the rain, opened the carriage door, and a voice called out with authority that silenced even the storm. "We have come for the future, Marquess of Ashworth." Every face in the ballroom turned slowly toward the stableman standing quietly beside the garden gate. But before we continue, if you enjoy emotional stories filled with shocking twists, hidden identities, and powerful family drama, make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel. And if you truly want to support the channel, you can use Super Thanks below. Your support helps us continue creating these unforgettable stories for you every single day. Now, let us begin. Long before the scandal that shattered the Haldron name across English society, there was silence. Not the comfortable silence found between people who understand one another, but the particular silence reserved for someone the world has quietly decided to forget. Thessaly Haldron moved through the corridors of Haldron Court the way morning fog drifted across the estate grounds, present everywhere, yet noticed by no one. At 26 years old, the eldest daughter of Duke Morven Haldron had become something far worse than disliked inside her own family. She had become invisible. The estate itself stood magnificent against the rolling hills of Devonshire, its pale stone walls rising 3 stories high beneath a slate-gray roof lined with iron chimneys that breathed thin smoke into the autumn sky. Rose gardens stretched behind the south wing, maintained by a team of groundskeepers who trimmed hedges into perfect geometric shapes that visitors admired from the terrace during afternoon tea. Inside, the halls gleamed with dark mahogany paneling, oil portraits of generations of Haldron ancestors, Persian carpets so thick that footsteps disappeared into them, and crystal chandeliers imported from Venice that scattered candlelight across every ceiling like trapped constellations. It was, by every measure, a house built to impress, and Thessaly had learned years ago that impression mattered far more than warmth inside those walls. Each morning followed the same invisible rhythm. While her younger sisters slept comfortably past 9, Thessaly rose before the servants finished lighting the kitchen fires. She checked inventory lists left unfinished from the previous evening. She inspected table arrangements before breakfast. She quietly corrected errors in household accounts that the steward, growing older and more forgetful each season, overlooked with increasing frequency. When guests arrived at Haldron Court, it was Thessaly who ensured their rooms smelled of fresh lavender, their linens carried no wrinkles, and their morning trays arrived precisely on time. Yet, nobody thanked her. Nobody even realized she was responsible. One gray October morning, while carrying a stack of pressed tablecloths through the servants' corridor toward the dining hall, she passed 2 footmen whispering beside the pantry entrance. "Lady Ravina wants the silver polished again before supper." "Polished it yesterday." She barely glanced at it. "Best not argue. You know how she gets." 1. They noticed Thessaly approaching and straightened immediately. She smiled gently and continued walking without comment. Servants never feared her the way they feared her sisters. That difference said everything the family refused to hear. Later that afternoon, Thessaly escaped into the stables, the only place on the estate where the air felt honest. The warm smell of hay, oiled leather, and horse sweat wrapped around her like a blanket the moment she stepped through the heavy wooden doors. Horses did not care about titles. They did not whisper behind fans or measure a woman's worth by the ring on her finger. She approached her favorite mare, a gentle chestnut named Copper, and pressed her forehead against the animal's warm neck while the rain tapped steadily against the stable roof above. "At least you are pleased to see me," she murmured quietly. Copper snorted softly and turned her velvet nose toward Thessaly's palm, searching for the sugar cube that always appeared. These stolen moments kept Thessaly breathing inside a house that seemed determined to suffocate her. The gardens, the stables, the small library tucked behind the east staircase where nobody ventured because the fireplace smoked terribly in winter. Those were her sanctuaries. Everywhere else, she was merely furniture. That evening, dinner unfolded with the usual performance. The long mahogany table stretched beneath twin chandeliers while candles flickered inside silver holders placed between platters of roasted venison, buttered parsnips, poached pears drizzled with honey, warm bread rolls wrapped in linen, and a tureen of chestnut soup that filled the room with a rich, earthy fragrance. Ravina sat closest to their father, as she always did, wearing an emerald gown that matched the jewels resting heavily against her collarbone. At 23, she had already secured what the family considered the greatest achievement a daughter could offer: a titled husband. Lord Drayton Selwick owned estates across 2 counties and held a seat in Parliament that Duke Morven discussed with transparent pride at every opportunity. Lysara, the youngest at 20, sat beside their mother, radiating the effortless confidence of a woman who had never once been ignored in her life. Her laughter carried easily across the table while she recounted a story involving a young baron who had sent flowers to the estate 3 times in a single week. "He is utterly besotted," Lysara announced while reaching for her wine glass. "Mother, you should have seen the size of the arrangement. The servants needed 2 men to carry it through the front entrance." Duchess Elaine smiled warmly. "A man who sends flowers with that much persistence is a man worth encouraging, darling." Thessaly sat at the far end of the table, nearest the door, farthest from the candlelight. She ate quietly while conversation floated around her without ever landing in her direction. Occasionally, a servant would glance toward her with quiet sympathy, but even they had learned not to draw attention to the eldest daughter's silence during family meals. Then Ravina turned her gaze down the table. "Thessaly, you look rather pale this evening. Have you been hiding in those stables again?" "I was reviewing the accounts for the quarter." "How thrilling." Ravina returned her attention to her wine glass. "I suppose someone must." Lysara giggled softly beside their mother, and the conversation moved on without pause, as though Thessaly had not spoken at all. After dessert, while the family moved into the drawing room for tea, Thessaly lingered near the dining hall entrance. Through the partially open door of her father's study, she could hear Duke Morven speaking with Lord Pemberton over brandy and cigars. "Both your younger daughters are extraordinary, Morven. Ravina especially has become quite the ornament of society. She has made the family proud." Duke Morven replied with unmistakable satisfaction. And the eldest? Thessaly, is it? A pause followed, long enough for Thessaly to feel her heartbeat thicken painfully inside her chest. Thessaly is different. Her father's voice carried the weary tone of a man discussing a problem he had stopped trying to solve. She has refused 3 proposals in 4 years. Perfectly respectable gentlemen, each one. She finds fault with every suitor presented to her. Remarkable stubbornness for a woman her age. Stubbornness is a kind word for it. Thessaly pressed her back against the corridor wall. Her fingers tightened around the fabric of her skirt until the knuckles whitened. She had heard versions of this conversation so many times that the words should have lost their power by now. They never did. She climbed the back staircase alone that night while music drifted faintly from the drawing room below, where her family laughed comfortably without noticing her absence. Inside her bedroom, she sat beside the window overlooking the darkened gardens, while rain blurred the glass into rivers of reflected candlelight. The estate below looked beautiful from a distance. Everything about the Haldren family looked beautiful from a distance. Only from inside could you feel how cold it truly was. The Haldren name carried weight across England the way stone carries heat from the sun. Slowly, deeply, and for generations longer than most families could trace their bloodlines. Duke Morven's grandfather had expanded the family fortune through wool and shipping during the wars against Napoleon. His father had tripled the estates through strategic marriages that connected Haldren blood to 3 of the most powerful families in the West Country. By the time Morven inherited the title, the Haldrens controlled farmland, timber, 2 coal interests, and a shipping partnership that brought tea and silk through Bristol Harbor every month without interruption. But wealth, in Morven's eyes, was never the point. Reputation was. "A fortune without standing is merely commerce," he once told his daughters during a Sunday dinner, his voice steady and certain as scripture. "Standing without fortune is merely nostalgia. A great family requires both, and marriages are the instruments through which both are secured." He repeated variations of this philosophy so frequently that even the servants could have recited it from memory. Every decision inside Haldren Court passed through this single filter. Which families to invite for shooting season, which charities to support publicly, which churches to attend, which daughters to present at which gatherings, and in what order, and wearing what. Nothing was accidental. Nothing was left to sentiment. Duchess Elaine enforced this system with quieter precision. Where Morven commanded, Elaine arranged. She managed the social calendar with the strategic patience of a chess player, accepting invitations that positioned the family beside the right names, while declining those that offered nothing useful. She studied other families the way generals study terrain, identifying weaknesses, alliances, and opportunities months before anyone else noticed them shifting. Together, they had built the Haldren reputation into something almost untouchable, and Thessaly threatened all of it simply by being herself. In Victorian society, an eldest daughter who remained unmarried past 25 attracted whispers. An eldest daughter who actively refused respectable proposals attracted scandal. Thessaly had done both. 3 times, carefully selected gentlemen had been invited to Haldren Court with the family's full encouragement. 3 times, Thessaly had declined. The first, Sir Aldous Graith, possessed enormous estates and a family name older than the monarchy itself. He also possessed the conversational depth of an empty room and spent the entirety of his visit discussing hunting dogs with such relentless enthusiasm that Thessaly excused herself from dinner on the second evening, claiming a headache she did not have. The second, Mr. Roland Fentress, arrived with impeccable manners and a fortune built from textile mills in Manchester. He smiled constantly, complimented everything, and agreed with every opinion offered to him regardless of whether he had heard the question properly. After 3 days, Thessaly quietly told her mother she would rather remain unmarried for the rest of her life than spend it beside a man who treated conversation like a mirror. The third, and the one that finally severed whatever remaining patience Duke Morven carried, was Lord Beckham Torrance. Wealthy, politically connected, and considered one of the most eligible bachelors in the Southwest. Torrance visited Haldren Court twice and spent both occasions speaking almost exclusively to Duke Morven about railway investments, while treating Thessaly like a decorative chair placed conveniently nearby. When Thessaly declined his proposal, her father's reaction echoed through the entire East Wing. "You refuse, Torrance." Duke Morven stood behind his desk, his voice dangerously level. "A man with 40,000 a year and a direct connection to the Home Secretary. He did not speak a single genuine word to me during 2 entire visits, Father." "Genuine words." The Duke repeated the phrase as though it were spoken in a foreign language. "You believe marriage is built upon genuine words?" "I believe it should be built upon something more than financial convenience." "Brand, then you are a fool." The coldness in his voice pressed against her like winter air. "And you are making fools of this family by association." From that evening forward, Duke Morven no longer discussed Thessaly's marriage prospects with hope. He discussed them with the resigned frustration of a man calculating losses. Duchess Elaine's disappointment emerged differently. She never raised her voice. She simply withdrew warmth so gradually that Thessaly could never identify the exact moment it disappeared. Compliments stopped arriving. Invitations to accompany her mother on social visits quietly ceased. New gowns arrived for Ravina and Lysara from London. Nothing arrived for Thessaly unless she specifically asked, and asking felt like begging for something that should have been freely given. At church on Sundays, Thessaly noticed women studying her with the particular expression reserved for cautionary tales. Mothers pulled their own daughters slightly closer, as though proximity to an unmarried woman past her prime might somehow prove contagious. "Such a waste," she overheard Lady Dorning whisper to another woman after services one morning. "She was considered quite handsome once, you know. But a woman who refuses perfectly good offers has only herself to blame for what follows." Thessaly kept walking. She had learned long ago that defending herself publicly only provided more material for people who had already decided her story. What nobody outside the estate understood was that Thessaly had not refused those men because she was difficult. She had refused them because something inside her recognized the difference between a transaction and a life. She had watched her mother smile dutifully beside her father for 27 years, without once seeing genuine affection pass between them. She had watched her father discuss his daughters the way merchants discuss inventory, measuring value by demand rather than substance. And she had decided, quietly and stubbornly and with full knowledge of the consequences, that she would rather endure loneliness than choose emptiness disguised as security. That decision cost her everything inside Haldren Court, except the work nobody else wanted to do. The announcement of Ravina's pregnancy arrived at Haldren Court like a second wedding, draped in celebrations so thick it suffocated every other conversation inside the estate for weeks. Duchess Elaine immediately ordered the household into preparation for a grand dinner honoring the occasion. Fresh flowers arrived daily from a hothouse in Bath. Bolts of cream and gold fabric were draped across the ballroom ceiling, while servants polished every surface until the manor reflected candlelight like the inside of a jeweled box. The kitchens operated without rest. Roasted lamb, stuffed with rosemary and garlic, turned slowly on iron spits, while pots of creamed leek soup bubbled beside trays of glazed carrots and honeyed beetroot. Pastry cooks worked through the night, shaping delicate marzipan figures, layering sponge cakes with raspberry preserves, and dusting sugared almond biscuits with powdered vanilla that drifted through the corridors like sweet fog. Naturally, the burden of organizing everything fell upon Thessaly. The florist sent white roses instead of ivory. Duchess Elaine announced during breakfast without looking up from her correspondence. "Someone must go to the village and correct the order before this afternoon." She did not say Thessaly's name. She did not need to. Everyone at the table understood who someone meant. Thessaly spent that morning negotiating with the florist, rearranging the seating chart after 2 families sent last-minute acceptances, supervising the hanging of new curtains in the guest bedrooms, and settling a disagreement between the cook and the wine steward over which vintage should accompany the fish course. By midday, exhaustion pressed behind her eyes like a headache waiting to arrive. Yet, nobody acknowledged her efforts even once. Ravina swept through the estate, radiating satisfaction that bordered on performance. Her pregnancy had elevated her status inside the family, to something almost sacred. Lord Drayton walked beside her with practiced attentiveness, though Thessaly noticed his eyes wandering toward the younger maids more often than propriety allowed. That afternoon, while Thessaly carried stacked porcelain serving dishes through the corridor, Ravina appeared from the drawing room in a pale blue gown that emphasized her condition with theatrical precision. "Thessaly, the candles in the east parlor are uneven. Guests will notice immediately. I will adjust them after I deliver these to the kitchen." "After?" Ravina raised one eyebrow. "Guests arrive in 4 hours. Honestly, if you managed this household with half the energy you waste in those stables, perhaps things would run more smoothly." Thessaly continued walking without answering. She had discovered years ago that responding to Ravina's criticisms only encouraged longer ones. By evening, Haldron Court overflowed with guests. Noble women in embroidered silk glided between rooms carrying crystal champagne glasses while their husbands gathered near the fireplaces debating politics and hunting seasons. The dining table stretched endlessly beneath golden light, covered with platters of roasted pheasant, smoked trout, garnished with dill and capers, buttered asparagus, warm bread rolls with salted butter, and towers of petit fours decorated with edible gold leaf. Thessaly stood near the musicians, adjusting a flower arrangement that had tilted slightly, when an older countess approached her with a kind but careless smile. "You there, dear. Would you fetch another bottle of the Bordeaux? This one has gone rather flat." The woman clearly believed she was speaking to household staff. Thessaly opened her mouth to respond politely when Lysera appeared beside them, wine glass already in hand. "That is our sister, Lady Wortham." Lysara smiled sweetly, though her eyes carried something sharper. "She does rather blend in with the furniture, does she not?" The Countess flushed with embarrassment while Lysara laughed lightly and moved on without correcting the humiliation she had just deepened. During supper, Ravina rose to address the table with Lord Drayton standing proudly beside her. "We are so grateful to share this joy with everyone," she announced, while candlelight caught the diamonds resting against her throat. "The Haldron family continues to grow stronger." Duchess Elaine beamed from across the table. Duke Morven lifted his glass with visible pride. "To the next generation," he declared warmly. "May they carry the family name with honor." Glasses rose across the room. Then, in the brief silence that followed, Lysara turned toward Thessaly with a look of carefully constructed sympathy. "Do not worry, Thessaly. Not every woman is meant for motherhood. Some are simply better suited to managing the linen closets." Soft laughter scattered across the nearest tables. Ravina covered her smile behind her napkin while Lord Drayton chuckled beside her. Duchess Elaine glanced toward Thessaly with a tight expression that said only one thing clearly: "Do not react. Do not embarrass us." Thessaly lowered her gaze to her plate and said nothing. After the final guests departed near midnight and the musicians packed their instruments into leather cases, Thessaly climbed the back staircase alone. The corridor outside her bedroom smelled of extinguished candles and cold stone. She locked the door behind her, sat on the edge of her bed, and pressed both hands hard against her face. She did not cry immediately. The tears arrived several minutes later, quiet and steady, the way rain falls after a storm has already passed. Not dramatic, not desperate. Just the slow, exhausted grief of someone who had spent the entire evening building something beautiful for people who would never once look at her and see anything but failure. A soft knock interrupted the silence. Brinley, the young chambermaid who had served Thessaly since childhood, entered carrying a cup of warm chamomile tea with a spoonful of honey stirred inside. "I thought you might want this tonight," Brinley said gently, while placing the cup beside the bed. Thessaly wiped her face quickly. "I am fine, Brinley. Truly. You are many things, Miss Thessaly. But tonight, fine is not one of them." The honesty in those words nearly undid her completely. Thessaly wrapped both hands around the warm cup while Brinley quietly drew the curtains closed against the cold night outside. "You did everything today," Brinley continued softly. "Every flower, every plate, every argument between the cook and the steward. You held this entire evening together while they sat and took the credit. It does not matter. Blay. It matters to those of us who notice." Brinley left the room without another word, and Thessaly sat alone in the candlelight, holding the tea against her chest while the manor settled into heavy silence around her. Somewhere below, she could hear her father's laughter drifting faintly through the study floor, warm and satisfied, and entirely unaware that his eldest daughter was sitting upstairs in the dark, wondering whether she would ever stop feeling like a stranger inside her own home. Years before silence became her permanent companion inside Haldren Court, Thessaly had once been the brightest voice in every room she entered. At 19, she carried herself with a confidence that surprised guests who expected quiet obedience from a duke's eldest daughter. She debated literature openly during dinner. She laughed freely in the gardens while chasing her younger sisters through the rose hedges. She played the pianoforte with such feeling that servants sometimes paused their work in the corridors just to listen through the walls. That was before Emmerich Vaughan arrived at the estate. He came during the summer of 1841, commissioned by a London publisher to illustrate the rare botanical species growing across the private grounds of prominent English estates. Lord Pemberton, a family friend with connections in the publishing world, had recommended Haldren Court for its ancient wisteria and its unusual collection of heritage roses cultivated across generations. Emmerich carried no title. He possessed no family fortune worth mentioning. What he carried instead were sketchbooks, filled with drawings so precise and alive that flowers seemed to breathe from the pages. He spoke softly, observed carefully, and moved through the gardens with a patience that revealed someone accustomed to noticing what others walked past without a second glance. Their first meeting happened beside the stone fountain near the south lawn, where Thessaly was reading beneath a magnolia tree while afternoon sunlight filtered through the branches above. Emmerich had been sketching the climbing jasmine wrapped around the nearby trellis when his pencil rolled across the gravel path and stopped against the edge of her book. "Forgive me," he said while retrieving it. Then he noticed the title in her hands. "You are reading Shelley." You say that as though it surprises you. Most people your age are reading society columns, not radical poets." Thessaly closed the book carefully. "Most people my age have not yet discovered that society columns are simply gossip dressed in better grammar." The corner of his mouth lifted. That single conversation lasted nearly an hour beneath the magnolia tree, and by the time the sun moved behind the western chimneys, Thessaly realized she had not thought about the expectations of Haldren Court even once during the entire exchange. Over the following weeks, their connection deepened with the quiet certainty of roots spreading beneath soil. Emmerich was unlike anyone who had ever entered the estate. While suitors complimented her appearance and praised her father's reputation, Emmerich asked what she thought about the world beyond Devonshire. He challenged her opinions without condescension and listened with the kind of attention that made Thessaly feel genuinely seen rather than merely assessed. They walked together through the wildflower meadows beyond the estate walls, while he explained the invisible structures hidden inside ordinary petals. He showed her how light changed the color of a single leaf across different hours of the day, and how patience revealed more than any amount of wealth could ever purchase. "You see things other people miss entirely," Thessaly told him one afternoon while watching him sketch the veins inside a translucent poppy held against the sun. "So do you," he replied without looking up from the page. "You simply live among people who have never asked you to." Those words settled somewhere deep inside her chest and stayed there permanently. Even Brinley noticed the change. "You are smiling again, Miss Thessaly," the chambermaid whispered one evening while brushing out her hair before bed. "Truly smiling, I mean. Not the kind you wear for guests." Thessaly blushed and changed the subject, but the warmth inside her was impossible to hide from someone who had watched her closely since childhood. Happiness, however, never survived long inside Haldren Court. One warm evening in late July, Duke Morven returned unexpectedly from a business trip to Bristol and found Thessaly and Emmerich sitting together on the garden bench near the greenhouse. They were not touching. They were not behaving improperly, by any honest measure. Emmerich was simply reading aloud from a volume of Keats, while Thessaly listened with her eyes closed and a softness across her face that told a father everything words did not need to say. The atmosphere changed the way weather changes before a storm, instantly and completely. That night, Thessaly was summoned to her father's study. The door was closed. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the walls lined with leather-bound ledgers and framed certificates of ancestral achievement. "You will not see that man again." Duke Morven did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The coldness in his tone carried more force than shouting ever could. "Father, Emmerich has done nothing improper. He is a tradesman's son with ink-stained fingers and a rented room in Cheapside. He has no land, no title, no future worth offering a woman of your standing." The Duke pressed his knuckles against the desk surface. This family did not survive 4 generations to watch its eldest daughter throw herself away on a man who draws flowers for a living. He is more than what he earns. Everyone is more than what they earn, Thessaly. That does not make them suitable. Duchess Elaine stood near the window throughout the exchange, silent as always when her husband decided something. Her presence was not support for Thessaly. It was endorsement of the verdict. The following morning, Emmerich was summoned to the Duke's study privately. Thessaly never learned exactly what was said behind that closed door, but the result was absolute. Emmerich left Haldron Court before noon. His sketchbooks, his travel case, and the half-finished illustration of the heritage roses were gone from the guest cottage by the time Thessaly reached the south lawn. No letter waited for her. No explanation arrived by post in the days that followed. Whatever Duke Morven had said, or threatened inside that study, had been devastating enough to make Emmerich disappear without a single word of farewell. Thessaly searched for weeks. She wrote letters to the London publisher who had commissioned the botanical illustrations, but the replies were vague and unhelpful. She asked Lord Pemberton, who suddenly claimed to know very little about the young illustrator's personal whereabouts. Everywhere she turned, doors closed with the quiet firmness of people who had been instructed to remain silent. By autumn, hope had grown so thin that holding onto it hurt worse than letting go. "Where did he go?" Thessaly asked Brinley one rainy evening while staring at the empty garden bench through her bedroom window. Brinley hesitated before answering. "I heard the steward say the Duke arranged for his publisher to cancel the commission entirely. Without the commission, he had no reason to stay in the countryside. Beyond that, nobody will tell me anything, Miss Thessaly." The realization that her father had not merely separated them but had dismantled the very livelihood that brought Emmerich to Devonshire struck Thessaly with a force she was unprepared to absorb. It was not simply a rejected suitor, it was an erasure. Her father had removed Emmerich Vaughan from her world so completely that even searching for him felt like grasping at someone who had been deliberately made to vanish. The young woman who once debated poets beside open windows and laughed freely in the gardens began fading that autumn. She stopped playing the pianoforte. She spoke less during dinners. She walked the grounds alone, passing the magnolia tree and the stone fountain without stopping, because stopping meant remembering, and remembering had become something her body could no longer afford. Nobody in the family acknowledged what had happened. It was simply absorbed into the silence of Haldron Court like smoke dissolving into cold air. And Thessaly learned, in the months that followed, that certain kinds of grief become permanent not because the pain stays sharp, but because the questions never receive answers. She never discovered what became of Emmerich Vaughan, and that unfinished silence grew louder inside her with every passing year. The seasons following Emmerich's disappearance pressed against Thessaly like stones laid one upon another, each year adding weight she was never permitted to acknowledge aloud. By the time Lysara's engagement was announced several years later, the eldest daughter of Haldron Court had been reshaped by grief into someone the household barely remembered existed. Lysara's intended was Sir Phelan Ashmore, a young baronet whose family owned a sprawling estate near Salisbury and whose charm operated with the smooth, practiced efficiency of a well-oiled clock. He smiled at precisely the right moments. He complimented precisely the right people. And he possessed precisely the kind of fortune that made Duke Morven's eyes brighten with satisfaction every time the subject of dowries and settlements entered the conversation. Phelan's family has connections to 3 members of Parliament. Duke Morven announced during breakfast one morning, folding his newspaper with the contented precision of a man whose investments were performing exactly as planned. This match strengthens us considerably. Duchess Elaine nodded beside him while spreading preserves across her toast. The Ashmores have excellent taste. Lysara will be well positioned. Thessaly ate her porridge in silence at the far end of the table. She had stopped expecting to be included in these discussions long ago. Preparations consumed the household for weeks. Seamstresses arrived from London carrying bolts of ivory satin and French lace, so delicate that servants were forbidden from breathing too heavily near the fitting room. Florists transformed the ballroom into what resembled an indoor garden, with arches of white peonies, hanging garlands of eucalyptus, and crystal vases overflowing with pale pink ranunculus placed beside every window. And once again, Thessaly managed everything behind the curtain while receiving nothing before it. She coordinated delivery schedules for imported wines. She resolved a crisis involving mismatched chair covers that reduced the housekeeper to tears. She personally repolished 47 pieces of silverware after discovering tarnish the footman had missed. She spent an entire afternoon on her knees in the ballroom, adjusting floral arrangements that had arrived arranged incorrectly, while her fingers bled from thorn pricks she did not mention to anyone. "The napkins need folding in the French style," Lysara instructed casually while passing through the dining hall without slowing down. "Phelan's mother is particular about such things. I have already completed them." "All 120? "All 120. Lysara did not thank her. She simply nodded and continued toward the drawing room, where Ravina waited with fabric samples for bridesmaids' gowns that Thessaly had not been invited to help select. The engagement dinner itself became another exhibition of everything Thessaly was not. The ballroom shimmered beneath hundreds of candles, while guests in embroidered gowns and polished metals moved between tables, overflowing with roasted duck, glazed in orange and thyme, creamed potatoes topped with chives, smoked salmon layered across dark bread, warm beetroot salad with crumbled cheese, and towering dessert displays featuring chocolate torts, lemon tartlets, and sugared violet petals scattered across white porcelain. Sir Phelan moved through the crowd with effortless confidence, shaking hands firmly with older gentlemen while offering subtle flattery to their wives. Lysara glowed beside him, her ivory gown catching the candlelight as though she had been designed specifically for this kind of evening. During the formal toast, Duke Morven stood with a pride so visible it seemed to radiate heat. "To my daughter Lysara and to Sir Phelan Ashmore," he declared while raising his glass beneath the chandelier. "A match that honors both families and promises a future built on strength and mutual distinction." Glasses clinked across the room. Then Ravina added with a practiced smile that carried poison beneath its polish, "Two daughters now settled with honor. What a blessing for any family." The emphasis on the word two landed exactly where it was intended. Several guests glanced briefly toward Thessaly, who stood near the far wall beside the musicians, before quickly looking away with the visible discomfort of people who understood cruelty, but chose not to challenge it. Later that evening, while guests danced and champagne flowed freely through the ballroom, Thessaly stepped outside through the servants' entrance into the cold garden. The November air stung against her flushed skin, but the silence felt medicinal after hours of smiling through pain. She sat on the stone bench near the greenhouse, the same bench where she had once listened to Emmerich read Keats on a warm summer evening that now felt like something she might have imagined entirely. Frost had already begun settling across the iron railings, and her breath formed small clouds that dissolved instantly into the darkness above. From inside, she could hear Lysara's laughter carrying through the ballroom windows, bright, confident, certain of its welcome in the world. Everything Thessaly's own voice had stopped being years ago. Then, from the corridor behind the kitchens, she overheard voices she recognized instantly. Duke Morven was speaking with Duchess Elaine near the pantry entrance, likely believing themselves alone, while servants worked noisily enough to mask the conversation from the ballroom. "Once Lysara is settled, there is no reason for Thessaly to remain at the estate," her father said with the tone of a man discussing seasonal staffing rather than his own child. "Where would she go?" Duchess Elaine asked carefully. "My sister's property near the Scottish border. The house is isolated enough to avoid further embarrassment. She could manage the household there quietly." Nobody of significance would need to know the details. Morven, she is still our daughter. She is a 26-year-old woman who has refused every opportunity this family offered her and contributed nothing to our standing in return. At some point, Elaine, sentiment must yield to practicality. A long silence followed. Duchess Elaine did not argue further. Thessaly pressed her hand against her mouth to keep the sound inside her chest from escaping. Exile. Her father was planning to send her to the most remote corner of England, not as punishment spoken aloud, but as a quiet disappearance that society would barely notice and the family would never need to explain. She sat on that frozen bench until her fingers went numb and her tears had dried into salt tracks against her cold cheeks. The ballroom continued glowing behind her, warm and golden and filled with people celebrating futures she was no longer expected to have. The only person who found her that night was Brinley, who appeared with a woolen shawl and wrapped it around Thessaly's shoulders without speaking a single word. Sometimes the kindest thing another person could offer was simply the willingness to sit beside someone in the cold, without asking them to explain why they were there. The following morning, while the household slept off champagne and rich food, Thessaly walked alone to the stables before dawn. The horses stirred quietly as she entered, their warm breath visible in the frigid air. She pressed her face into Copper's neck and stood there for a long time, breathing slowly, feeling the steady heartbeat of a creature who had never once asked her to be anything other than exactly who she was. Something inside Thessaly shifted that morning, not dramatically, not with the sharp clarity of a decision announced aloud. But somewhere, deep beneath the exhaustion and the grief and the years of silence, a quiet certainty began forming like the first thin crack in a frozen lake. She could not remain here forever, and the people who should have loved her most had already begun planning a world without her in it. Far from the green hills of Devonshire, beyond the shipping lanes of Bristol and the industrial smoke of Birmingham, the Ashworth estate stood like a cathedral carved from stone and silence against the wild Northumbrian coastline. Windswept cliffs dropped sharply into cold gray water below the eastern walls, while ancient forests of oak and birch stretched inland for miles behind the manor, broken only by narrow riding paths and stone walls built centuries before anyone alive could remember why. Ashworth Hall itself was enormous, not the polished, decorative enormity of estates designed to impress visiting politicians, but the heavy, weathered enormity of a house that had survived wars, plagues, and the slow erosion of dynasties without ever needing to explain itself to anyone. Dark stone walls rose 3 stories high, lined with narrow windows that watched the sea like old eyes accustomed to storms. Towers anchored the northern and southern corners, remnants of a time when the estate served military purposes as well as domestic ones. Inside, the corridors smelled of wood smoke, aged leather, and salt air that crept through every crack the builders had never managed to seal completely. The Ashworth title carried a weight in England that most aristocratic families understood instinctively, even if they rarely spoke of it openly. The marquessate had existed since the reign of Henry VII, predating most dukedoms and nearly all the industrial fortunes that newer families mistook for permanence. Ashworth land generated income from timber, sheep farming, coastal fishing rights, and mineral deposits that had quietly funded the family for generations without the vulgar visibility of factory wealth. Yet the current heir to all of this had not set foot inside Ashworth Hall for nearly 2 years. Calder Ashworth had vanished from aristocratic society the way smoke vanishes from a chimney, slowly at first, then completely. At 32 years old, he had once been considered among the most eligible men in England, tall, serious, and carrying the particular confidence of someone raised understanding exactly what he would one day inherit. Calder moved through London's ballrooms and political gatherings with the quiet authority of a man who never needed to raise his voice to command a room. Women admired him openly. Ambitious mothers positioned their daughters beside him at every opportunity. He possessed the rare combination of ancient title and genuine substance that society treated like currency more valuable than gold. Then Lady Ines Marchford destroyed everything. Ines entered Calder's life during the London season of 1846, introduced through mutual connections at a charity ball hosted by the Countess of Pemberton. She was striking rather than conventionally beautiful, with sharp, dark eyes and a laugh that made people lean closer without understanding why. She spoke with intelligence that seemed effortless, and carried herself with the particular ease of a woman who understood precisely how to make powerful men feel simultaneously comfortable and fascinated. Calder, who had spent years surrounded by women whose conversations felt rehearsed and whose affection felt strategic, believed he had finally found someone genuine. Their courtship became the subject of widespread admiration across London society. Newspapers mentioned them together at the opera. Hostesses arranged seating to place them side by side at important dinners. Calder's elderly father, the Marquess, expressed quiet satisfaction from Ashworth Hall, relieved that his only son appeared to be building the kind of partnership the family needed to continue. For nearly a year, Calder trusted her completely. He shared private thoughts he had never spoken aloud to anyone. He discussed his anxieties about inheriting the estate, his frustrations with political expectations, and his genuine desire to use the Ashworth resources for purposes beyond mere preservation of wealth. Ines listened with apparent warmth, asked thoughtful questions, and offered reassurance that felt sincere enough to build a future upon. The betrayal arrived not through rumor but through evidence. Calder discovered himself. While arranging documents inside Ines's writing desk at her family's London townhouse, preparing a surprise for her birthday, he found letters. Dozens of them, written over months in handwriting he did not recognize, filled with affectionate language that left no room for innocent interpretation. The letters were from Lord Soren Blackwell, a younger son of a wealthy industrial family who lacked title, but possessed the reckless charm that certain women found irresistible when combined with genuine desire. Ines had maintained the relationship throughout her entire courtship with Calder. Every evening she spent beside him at the opera. Every private conversation they shared beside the fireplace. Every reassurance she offered about their future together had coexisted alongside a secret connection she never intended to end. The confrontation happened inside Calder's study on a Tuesday evening in November, while rain hammered against the tall windows overlooking Grosvenor Square. "You knew from the beginning." Calder's voice remained level, despite the fury pressing against his ribs. Every word between us was a performance. Ines stood near the door, her expression shifting between defiance and calculation. "You are being dramatic." Dramatic. He placed the letters on the desk between them. "A year of deception, and I am being dramatic. Soren means nothing." "Then why does he fill 37 letters addressed to the woman who promised her future to me?" Ines's composure cracked for the first time, not with guilt, with frustration at being discovered. "You wanted a partner who fit your expectations, Calder. A woman who smiled correctly and spoke properly and admired your estate with appropriate reverence. You never once asked what I actually wanted. What you wanted was my title with another man's affection. I simply had the misfortune of believing you were capable of honesty." The words ended the conversation. Ines left that evening, and what followed was worse than the betrayal itself. Within weeks, London society had rewritten the story entirely. Ines, understanding that reputation was her only remaining currency, spread whispered suggestions that Calder had been cold, controlling, and emotionally unavailable throughout their relationship. That she had been driven toward Soren Blackwell by loneliness inflicted by a man incapable of genuine feeling. The narrative spread through drawing rooms and dinner parties with the speed of fire through dry timber. Women who once admired Calder now studied him with suspicion. Men who once respected his composure now interpreted his quietness as confirmation of the accusations. The very qualities that had made him respected became the evidence used against him. His elderly father's health worsened noticeably during this period, though the Marquess never spoke about the scandal directly. He simply grew quieter, ate less, and spent longer hours staring from the windows of Ashworth Hall toward the sea, as though waiting for something that no longer existed. One bitter January evening, Calder sat alone inside his London study, surrounded by unopened invitations and untouched correspondence. The fire had burned low. The house was silent except for the steady ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece and the occasional sound of wind pressing against the windows. He made the decision that night with the calm certainty of a man who had examined every alternative and found them all unacceptable. Within a fortnight, Calder closed the London townhouse, dismissed the city staff with generous severance, and informed his father's steward, old Fenwick, that he would be traveling indefinitely. He left behind his title, his social obligations, and the carefully maintained reputation that London had already decided to destroy on his behalf. He took only a horse, a leather traveling bag, and a name that belonged to no one of importance, Calder Wynne, a common surname borrowed from his mother's maternal grandmother, a Welsh woman who had married into the Ashworth family 2 generations earlier and whose name had been forgotten by everyone except the handwritten family Bible kept inside the estate chapel. For months, he traveled through the English countryside, taking work wherever honest labor was offered. He repaired fences in Somerset. He loaded cargo at the Bristol docks. He helped rebuild a stone wall damaged by flooding near a sheep farm in Dorset. Each job stripped away another layer of the aristocratic world he had grown to distrust. And each day spent among people who judged him by the quality of his work rather than the history of his blood reminded him that genuine character existed. It simply lived far below the ballrooms and drawing rooms where he had wasted years searching for it. Then, on an overcast afternoon in late September, a listing in a village newspaper caught his attention. Haldron Court, Devonshire. Stableman required. Room and board provided. Apply directly to the head groom. The name Haldron meant nothing to Calder. It was simply another estate, another opportunity for quiet, honest work far from the world that had taught him to distrust every polished smile and carefully constructed compliment. He arrived at the estate the following morning, leading his horse along the gravel drive while the great house rose slowly before him through the morning mist. Pale stone walls, iron chimneys, rose gardens clipped into perfect geometry. Everything about the place whispered wealth and control. The kind of house where appearances mattered more than truth, and where people were measured by what they could offer rather than who they actually were. Calder almost turned around. Almost. But then, through the open stable doors, he heard something that stopped him completely. A woman's voice, soft and warm, speaking to a horse with the kind of gentle patience most people reserved only for those they truly loved. "There you are, Copper. I brought you something." He could not see her face yet, but something in that voice, quiet and unguarded and entirely unaware of being overheard, told him that not everyone inside this house was made of the same cold stone as its walls. Calder adjusted the traveling bag on his shoulder and walked toward the stables. Calder was hired within the hour. The head groom, a broad-shouldered man named Harkin who smelled permanently of saddle oil and pipe tobacco, asked only 3 questions. Could he handle horses? Could he rise before dawn? Could he keep quiet and avoid troubling the family? Calder answered yes to all 3. And by afternoon he occupied a narrow room above the stable block with a single window overlooking the paddock and a straw mattress that creaked loudly beneath him every time he turned during the night. He did not mind. The work was honest. The horses were well bred, and the rhythms of the stable, feeding, brushing, mucking, exercising the animals across the grounds before breakfast, provided a structure that silenced the restless noise inside his mind more effectively than anything London had ever offered. For the first several days, Thessaly appeared only briefly. She arrived in the mornings wearing a plain dress and carrying sugar cubes for Copper, spoke softly to the mare, and departed without acknowledging the new stableman beyond a polite nod. Calder observed her from a distance, noting how different she seemed from the rest of the household. No jewelry, no performance, no expectation of service from anyone around her. Their first real conversation happened on a wet Thursday afternoon, when the sky turned black with storm clouds and Calder was securing the stable doors against the wind. Thessaly had arrived later than usual, her hair damp from the rain and her shoes muddied from crossing the south garden on foot, rather than using the covered walkway reserved for the family. "You should come inside," Calder called out from beneath the stable overhang. "This weather will not ease for hours." She stepped through the doorway and shook the rain from her sleeves. "I needed to see Copper. She becomes anxious during storms." "She does." Calder paused, surprised. Most owners of expensive horses never learned their animals' temperaments beyond basic riding behavior. How did you know that? I pay attention. Thessaly moved toward Copper's stall and pressed her palm flat against the mare's trembling flank. People notice what they are trained to notice. I was never trained to notice the right things according to this household, so I noticed other things instead. Calder watched her settle the horse with patient, unhurried strokes, while the rain hammered against the roof above them. There was something in her voice that he recognized. Not sadness exactly. Something older than sadness. The particular quietness of someone who had been overlooked so thoroughly that they had stopped expecting recognition as a possibility. He had heard that tone before, inside his own voice, during the months after Ines. "You speak differently than the other servants," Thessaly said suddenly without turning around. Calder's hands paused on the bridle he was cleaning. "How so?" "Your sentences are complete. You do not drop words the way men who have worked stables their entire lives typically do. And your hands." She glanced briefly toward him. "They have calluses, but they are recent. The skin beneath them is too smooth for someone who has spent years in manual labor." The observation struck him with uncomfortable precision. He had underestimated her immediately, and the realization carried an unfamiliar sting of respect. "Perhaps I simply had a different life before this one," he offered carefully. "Perhaps." She returned her attention to Copper without pressing further. "We all had different lives before this one." The silence that followed was not awkward. It was the rare, clean silence between two people who understood that some truths revealed themselves only to those patient enough to wait. Over the following weeks, these small encounters multiplied without either of them deliberately seeking the other out. Thessaly continued visiting the stables each morning, and Calder continued working around her without intrusion. They exchanged observations about the horses, about the weather, about the habits of the estate's garden birds that Thessaly could identify by sound alone. Each conversation lasted slightly longer than the one before. Each revealed slightly more than either had intended. Calder noticed things. The way servants treated Thessaly with genuine warmth, while treating her sisters with the rigid formality of people performing duties they did not enjoy. The way fresh flowers appeared in the kitchen and the servants' quarters, placed there quietly by Thessaly on mornings when nobody watched. The way she mended a torn blanket belonging to a stable boy without being asked, folding it neatly on his cot while the boy was exercising horses in the paddock. He also noticed things that tightened something protective inside his chest. The way Thessaly flinched slightly whenever her father's voice echoed from the main house. The way she walked through the estate's grand corridors pressed close to the walls, as though trying to occupy as little space as possible. The way her sisters addressed her with casual cruelty so habitual that even the servants winced hearing it. One evening, while Calder repaired a broken saddle rack in the tack room, Harkin sat nearby smoking his pipe and studying the new stableman with the quiet appraisal of a man who had spent 40 years judging character through observation rather than conversation. "You have noticed her," Harkin said plainly. Calder did not pretend to misunderstand. "She is difficult not to notice. She is the only person in that house worth noticing." Harkin drew slowly on his pipe. "Every kindness in this estate flows from her. Every thank you. Every moment of genuine warmth the staff experience under this roof comes from Miss Thessaly, and they repay her with silence at best and cruelty at worst." He exhaled a thin stream of smoke toward the ceiling. "I have worked these stables since before she was born, watched her grow from a bright, laughing child into whatever she has been forced to become inside those walls. And I will tell you something plainly, Mr. Wynne. Whatever you are, wherever you came from, and whatever brought you here, that woman deserves better than anything this family has ever given her." Calder said nothing, but the words embedded themselves somewhere deep inside his memory and refused to leave. The incident that changed everything happened on a cold November morning, 3 weeks after Calder's arrival. Lysara was hosting a riding excursion for Sir Phelan and several of his friends visiting from Salisbury. The young gentlemen had been celebrating since breakfast, and by the time they reached the stables, their laughter carried the careless loudness of men who mistook recklessness for confidence. One of Phelan's companions, A red-faced young lord whose name Calder never bothered to learn, demanded a horse that Harkin had specifically reserved for resting due to a strained fetlock. "That animal is recovering from an injury," Calder said firmly while blocking the stall entrance. "Riding her today could cause permanent damage." The young lord stared at him with the lazy contempt of someone who had never been refused anything by a person of lower standing. "I was not asking your opinion, stableman. Saddle the horse." "No." The single word landed between them like a stone dropped into still water. Sir Phelan appeared beside his friend with an amused expression. "Is there a problem here?" "Your servant appears to have forgotten his station," the young lord replied while adjusting his riding gloves with exaggerated patience. Before the confrontation could escalate, Thessaly appeared in the stable entrance. She had been crossing the courtyard carrying a basket of herbs from the kitchen garden and had heard the raised voices from outside. She assessed the situation within seconds, the injured horse shifting nervously inside the stall, the flushed, aggressive visitors, Calder standing firm between them and the animal, Harkin watching from the far corner with clenched fists, and the visible restraint of a man who understood that confronting a nobleman's guest meant instant dismissal. "Gentlemen," Thessaly said calmly while stepping forward, "that mare sustained an injury 4 days ago and is under the veterinarian's instructions to rest completely. I confirmed the arrangement personally with our head groom." She turned toward Phelan with a composure that carried far more authority than her plain dress and muddied shoes suggested. "There are several excellent horses available in the East Paddock. Harkin can have them saddled within minutes." The young lord opened his mouth to argue, but something in Thessaly's steady gaze made the words dissolve before they arrived. She was not angry. She was not pleading. She simply stood between a vulnerable creature and the people threatening to harm it, with the quiet certainty of someone who would not move regardless of the consequences. Sir Phelan studied her for a moment, then laughed lightly and clapped his friend on the shoulder. "Come, Wentworth. No need to fight over horseflesh. Let us take the others." The group moved toward the East Paddock, their laughter resuming as though nothing had occurred. Lysara followed without acknowledging her sister at all. In the silence that remained, Thessaly exhaled slowly and pressed her hand briefly against the injured mare's neck before turning to leave. "Thank you," Calder said quietly. She paused near the stable door and looked back at him. "You were already protecting her. I simply had a surname they were obligated to acknowledge." "That is not all you did." Their eyes held for a moment longer than either expected. Then Thessaly nodded once and walked back toward the house, carrying her herb basket with both hands, while rain began falling softly against the courtyard stones behind her. Calder stood in the doorway, watching her disappear through the servants' entrance. Something had shifted inside his chest with the permanence of a key turning inside a lock. For nearly 2 years, he had traveled across England convinced that authenticity had been driven from the aristocratic world entirely, that every person born into privilege eventually revealed the same hollow core of self-interest that Inez had hidden beneath practiced warmth and strategic charm. This woman had just placed herself between cruelty and a creature that could offer her nothing in return. Not for recognition, not for advantage, simply because it was the right thing to do. Old Harkin appeared beside him, pipe between his teeth, watching the same empty doorway. "Now you understand," Harkin said simply. Calder did not reply, but for the first time since leaving London, he was not certain he wanted to leave. What happened next would be spoken about across every drawing room in Devonshire for years. The catalyst arrived not as a dramatic confrontation, but as a quiet accumulation of small truths that finally reached a weight Thessaly could no longer carry in silence. 3 days before the Christmas ball at Haldren Court, Thessaly overheard a conversation that erased her last remaining hope that this family would ever see her as anything other than a burden to manage. Ravina and Lysara were seated together in the morning room, unaware that Thessaly had paused in the corridor outside to adjust a tray of fresh candles she was delivering to the guest wing. "Father spoke with Aunt Cecilia last week," Ravina said casually while embroidering a handkerchief. "The arrangements are nearly settled. After Christmas, Thessaly will be sent to the Scottish property indefinitely." "Indefinitely." Lysara repeated the word with the satisfied tone of someone savoring a dessert. "That is a polite way of saying permanently." Mother apparently made a feeble objection, but father reminded her that keeping Thessaly here only draws attention to the family's one visible failure. His words, not mine. Will she be told beforehand? Does it matter? Where else would she go? Soft laughter passed between them, the sound of two women discussing the disposal of an inconvenience rather than the exile of their own sister. Thessaly set the candle tray down on the hallway table with trembling hands. She did not cry. The tears had been spent years ago on grief and loneliness, and unanswered questions about a man who drew flowers and vanished into silence. What remained was something different, something harder and clearer than grief. A decision. She walked to the stables that afternoon without urgency, without drama, and without the particular heaviness that had accompanied her movements for years. Something had lifted. Not the pain, but the obligation to endure it endlessly, for people who had already stopped considering her human. Calder was repairing a leather harness near the tack room when she entered. He looked up and immediately registered something different in her expression. The careful blankness she usually wore inside the estate walls had been replaced by a quiet, steady clarity that he had never seen before. "I am leaving Haldren Court," she said. The words landed simply between them, but the weight they carried was enormous. "When?" Calder asked. "Before Christmas. Before they send me somewhere I did not choose." He set the harness down carefully. "Where will you go?" "I do not know yet, but I would rather face uncertainty on my own terms than accept exile on theirs." A long silence passed between them. The horses shifted quietly in their stalls. Rain tapped against the stable roof with the patience of something that had been falling for centuries and would continue long after both of them were gone. "Then I will go with you," Calder said. Thessaly stared at him. "You cannot be serious. You have no means of traveling safely alone. No connections outside this county. No resources beyond whatever you can carry in one case." He met her eyes with the directness she had noticed from their very first conversation. "And I have no reason to stay here without the only person in this household worth staying for." The honesty in that statement pressed against something inside Thessaly's chest that she had believed was permanently closed. She did not respond immediately. She simply held his gaze while the rain continued falling and the horses breathed warmly around them. "I cannot ask that of you," she finally said. "You did not ask," I offered. They planned to leave on the morning of the Christmas ball, before anyone could force the exile arrangements into motion. But fate, it turned out, was already traveling south. On the evening before the ball, while the household hummed with preparations and servants carried crates of champagne through the back corridors, old Fenwick sat inside a hired carriage, rattling through the December darkness toward Devonshire. Beside him rested a leather document case containing a death certificate, a solicitor's letter, and the formal summons that would change everything. Fenwick had spent 3 months searching for Calder. The young lord had covered his tracks carefully, but not perfectly. A shipping clerk in Bristol remembered a well-spoken laborer who handled cargo with unusual precision. A sheep farmer in Dorset recalled a quiet man named Wynne who repaired stone walls with the steady patience of someone accustomed to waiting. And finally, a village newspaper listing for a stableman position at Haldren Court, Devonshire, matched the last direction Fenwick's inquiries had pointed. The old steward traveled through the night, his aging bones protesting every frozen mile, driven by the unshakable loyalty of a man who had served the Ashworth family for 40 years and would not allow the title to pass unclaimed. The morning of the Christmas ball broke gray and wet over Haldren Court, rain falling steadily against the pale stone walls while servants rushed preparations inside. Thessaly descended the main staircase carrying a single leather traveling case, while the household buzzed with preparations around her. She wore her plainest dress. No jewelry, no gloves. She walked through the entrance hall with the measured calm of someone who had already grieved the life she was leaving behind. Duke Morven intercepted her near the front doors. "Where do you think you are going?" "Away." "Away?" The word sounded absurd in his mouth. "Away to where? With what? You have nothing without this family, Thessaly. No income, no standing, no prospects. I have myself. That will have to be enough." Ravina appeared from the drawing room, her expression shifting rapidly from confusion to disbelief to something that resembled genuine alarm. Not concern for her sister, but alarm at the scandal this departure would create. "You cannot simply walk out," Ravina said sharply. "People will talk. People have talked about me for years, Ravina. The only difference is that now, I will not be here to absorb it quietly." Lysara emerged behind Ravina, and when her eyes followed Thessaly's gaze through the open front doors to where Calder stood waiting quietly beside the garden gate, her expression transformed into something caught between fury and theatrical horror. "The stableman," Lysara's voice carried loud enough for the servants gathering in the corridor to hear. "You are leaving with the stableman." Guests who had arrived early for the ball began appearing in doorways and along the upper gallery railing, drawn by the commotion. Lord Pemberton stood near the tall windows, wineglass already in hand, watching the scene unfold with the fascinated attention of a man who recognized he was witnessing something that would be discussed for decades. The entrance hall of Haldren Court became an amphitheater of whispered shock, gloved hands rising to cover open mouths, and eyes widening with the hungry fascination of people witnessing someone else's catastrophe in real time. Duke Morven's face drained of color. When he spoke again, his voice was low and controlled, and more devastating than any shout could have been. "If you walk through those doors with that man, you are no longer my daughter. You will carry nothing of the Haldren name. No inheritance, no support, no welcome in this house. Ever." Thessaly looked at her father with an expression that contained no anger, only exhaustion. And beneath the exhaustion, the faintest shimmer of something that might have been relief. "You stopped treating me as your daughter years ago, Father. I am simply making it official." She turned toward the enormous front doors, and that was when the sound of hooves and iron wheels grinding sharply against wet gravel echoed through the entrance hall. A carriage unlike anything the guests had ever seen rolled to a halt outside the estate. Black lacquered wood trimmed with silver filigree, 4 matching horses the color of midnight. And upon its doors, a crest so ancient and powerful that Lord Pemberton dropped his wine glass directly onto the marble floor. The entrance hall fell absolutely silent. A liveried footman stepped down into the rain, opened the carriage door, and old Fenwick emerged. His traveling coat was dusty from the road, his white hair uncombed from the overnight journey, but he stood with the straight-backed dignity of a man delivering a message that outranked every person present. His eyes found Calder immediately. "My Lord Ashworth." Fenwick's voice carried across the entrance hall with quiet, unmistakable authority. "Your father, the 7th Marquess, passed 11 days ago. I have traveled from Northumberland to inform you that the title, the estate, and all attending responsibilities now fall to you." He paused, and when he spoke again, every word landed with the weight of centuries. "We have come for the future, Marquess of Ashworth." Every face in the entrance hall turned slowly toward the stableman, standing quietly beside the garden gate. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Duke Morven stood frozen behind his wall of certainty and felt the ground dissolve beneath him. The man he had just publicly called a servant, the man he had dismissed as worthless before his entire household. That man carried a title older than the Haldren name by 2 centuries and governed an estate whose annual income dwarfed everything Morven had spent a lifetime building. Ravina's hand found the doorframe beside her and gripped it so tightly the wood creaked beneath her gloves. Her lips moved without producing sound, as though rehearsing explanations she already knew nobody would believe. Lysara's face drained to the color of chalk. The woman who had mocked her sister for choosing a man who shoveled hay now stood watching that same man receive a title that placed him above every gentleman she had ever curtsied to. Sir Phelan, standing behind Lysara, let out a low whistle of genuine astonishment that would have been inappropriate in any other circumstance but felt entirely earned in this one. Lord Pemberton, standing in the spreading pool of his own spilled wine, whispered to no one in particular. "Heavens above!" Thessaly stared at Calder from across the entrance hall. The leather traveling case still hung from her hand. Rain fell softly between them through the open doors, darkening the gravel outside and filling the silence with its steady rhythm. "You should have told me," she said quietly. Not with anger. With the raw, honest bewilderment of a woman who had already lost one man to secrets kept without her consent, and was now discovering that the man she chose carried the largest secret of all. Calder stepped toward her. His voice was low enough that only she could hear it clearly, though the silence in the hall was so absolute that his words reached every corner regardless. If I had told you who I was, you would have seen the title before you saw me. Everyone does. That is precisely why I left. I am not everyone. No. His voice softened with a tenderness that made Brinley, watching from the servants' corridor, press both hands against her heart. You are not. And that is exactly why I am standing here. A silence passed between them that contained more than any speech could have carried. Then Thessaly set her traveling case down on the marble floor, looked once more at her father, her sisters, and the entrance hall full of people who had spent years measuring her worth by everything except the things that mattered. I was leaving with you before I knew any of this, she said steadily. That has not changed. Calder extended his hand. She took it. They walked together through the front doors of Haldron Court and into the December rain. Old Fenwick held the carriage door open with trembling, loyal hands, while the household watched in devastated silence from behind the tall windows. The last thing the guests saw before the Ashworth carriage disappeared down the gravel drive was the family crest gleaming on its doors, ancient and unmistakable, carrying away the woman they had all dismissed and the man they had all despised toward a life none of them could have imagined. The news spread across English society like fire through dry timber. Every letter Duke Morven had written calling the stableman a servant of low character now read like a confession of catastrophic misjudgment. Ravenna, who had told Lady Dorning that Thessaly had simply lost her senses, now avoided Lady Dorning entirely, after the older woman delivered the truth at a January tea with considerably more satisfaction than diplomacy. Your sister did not run away with a stableman, dear. She left with one of the most powerful men in England. How perfectly amusing. Lysara learned the full extent of the humiliation through whispered conversations that stopped abruptly whenever she entered a room. The cautionary tale that mothers had told their daughters about the danger of excessive independence had been rewritten overnight. Now it was a story about a woman brave enough to choose character over title and wise enough to recognize a man's worth before the world revealed it for her. The family that had publicly ridiculed Thessaly, mourned her departure as evidence of madness, and systematically destroyed her reputation, now faced a truth so devastating that no amount of social maneuvering could rewrite it. The woman they dismissed had chosen better than any of them, and the man they mocked as worthless was worth more than their entire family combined. During the long journey north to Ashworth Hall, Calder told Thessaly everything. The betrayal by Enos, the destruction of his reputation, the decision to abandon a world that valued performance over substance. The months of traveling and working, searching for proof that genuine character still existed somewhere beyond the suffocating theater of aristocratic life. And then I heard your voice in the stables, he said quietly while the carriage rocked gently along the frozen roads, speaking to a horse with more kindness than anyone in that house had ever spoken to you. And I understood that what I had been searching for was standing right there in a muddy dress with sugar cubes in her pocket. Thessaly leaned her head against the cold glass of the carriage window and watched the English countryside roll past, white and silent beneath the winter sky. I forgive you for not telling me, she said after a long pause, because you were right. I would never have seen you clearly through the weight of a title like that. Nobody could. You saw me clearly anyway. That is precisely the point. The formal ceremony at Ashworth Hall took place on a cold February morning, while frost clung to the ancient stone walls, and the North Sea crashed distantly against the cliffs below the eastern towers. Calder assumed his father's title with the quiet solemnity the occasion demanded, surrounded by a state staff, tenant families, and a small gathering of northern aristocracy who had known the Ashworth name for generations. But it was the private moment afterward that carried the true weight of the day. In the chapel adjoining the main hall, beneath stained glass windows that filtered winter sunlight into pools of amber and blue across the stone floor, Calder turned to Thessaly and spoke with a steadiness that contained no performance, no calculation, and no awareness of anything in the world beyond the woman standing before him. I have spent 2 years searching for something I was told no longer existed. Honesty without conditions. Kindness without expectation of return. The willingness to stand between cruelty and those who cannot defend themselves, even when the cost is everything you have. He took her hand. Your family called you difficult because you refused to become empty. They called you a failure because you would not trade your integrity for comfort. They called you worthless because they measured worth by everything except the things that actually matter. His voice did not waver. I am not asking you to become a Marchioness. I am asking you to remain exactly who you already are. Because the woman who brought sugar cubes to a nervous horse every morning and mended blankets for stable boys who never knew her name and stood between injured animals and careless men without hesitating, that woman is worth more than every title, every estate, and every polished reputation I have ever encountered. Thessaly held his gaze without blinking. Tears moved silently down her face, but her expression carried something far beyond sadness. It carried the overwhelming, almost unbearable relief of a person who had spent their entire life being told they were not enough, finally standing before someone who saw them completely and chose them precisely because of everything the world had rejected. Yes, she said. They married 3 weeks later in the same chapel. Brinley, who had traveled north at Thessaly's personal invitation, wept openly throughout the ceremony, while old Fenwick stood beside Calder with the proud, trembling composure of a man who had watched a boy grow into someone worthy of the name he carried. The years that followed wrote a story that English society could not ignore no matter how desperately some of its members wished to. Thessaly transformed Ashworth Hall not through renovation or expenditure, but through the same quiet, persistent kindness that had once gone unnoticed inside Haldren Court. She established a school for tenant children on the estate grounds. She opened the manor's library to local families on weekends. She personally oversaw improvements to worker housing that other aristocratic estates would not consider for another generation. And she treated every person who entered Ashworth Hall, from visiting dignitaries to the youngest kitchen apprentice, with the same unhurried respect that Brinley had recognized in her since childhood. Calder governed the estate with the steady, principled authority of a man who understood what privilege meant, because he had voluntarily surrendered it and earned it back through honest labor. Together, they became one of the most respected families in northern England, admired not for the antiquity of their title, but for the character with which they carried it. Meanwhile, the lives that once glittered so brightly inside Haldren Court dimmed with steady, almost poetic inevitability. Lord Drayton Selwick's wandering attention, which Thessaly had noticed years earlier at Ravena's celebration dinner, eventually wandered beyond recovery. His involvement with a young actress in Bath became public knowledge after letters were discovered by a household servant with a grudge and sold to a London gossip sheet. Ravenna endured the scandal with rigid composure, but the marriage that Duke Morven had once toasted as the family's greatest achievement became its most visible wound. Sir Phelan Ashmore's effortless charm proved to be exactly that, effortless and therefore without substance. Within 2 years of his marriage to Lysara, his debts exceeded his income, his political connections evaporated when they were no longer useful, and Lysara discovered that a man who agreed with everyone ultimately stood for nothing. The Ashmore estate was quietly mortgaged, and Lysara's letters to her mother grew shorter and more desperate with each passing season. Duke Morven aged visibly during these years, though he never acknowledged the irony publicly. The daughter he exiled had risen, the daughters he celebrated had fallen, and the reputation he had spent a lifetime constructing proved far more fragile than the character he had spent that same lifetime dismissing. On an autumn afternoon 4 years after the departure from Haldren Court, a carriage bearing the Selwick crest appeared on the gravel drive of Ashworth Hall. Ravenna and Lysara stepped out together, their faces carrying the deep exhaustion of women who had finally run out of alternatives. Thessaly met them in the entrance hall. She did not gloat. She did not remind them of the ballroom, the laughter, the linen closet remark, the plans to exile her to Scotland, or the letters that painted her as a madwoman seduced by a servant. She looked at her sisters the way she had once looked at the injured mare in the Haldren stables, with steady, unsentimental compassion for creatures in pain, regardless of whether they deserved it. "You are welcome here," she said simply, "for as long as you need." Ravina's composure broke for the first time in her adult life. She pressed her gloved hand against her mouth and turned away while her shoulders trembled silently. Lysara, who had once told Thessaly she was better suited to managing linen closets than motherhood, stood in the entrance hall of an estate, grander than any she had ever entered, and looked at her eldest sister with an expression that contained something she had never directed toward Thessaly before: respect. That evening, while her sisters rested in guest rooms overlooking the sea and Calder read quietly beside the fireplace in the library, Thessaly stepped outside onto the stone terrace and stood beneath a sky filled with more stars than Devonshire had ever offered. The wind carried salt from the cliffs below and the faint sound of waves breaking against ancient rock. Behind her, Ashworth Hall glowed warmly through its tall windows, filled with the life she had built from nothing except the qualities her family once told her were worthless: kindness, patience, the refusal to become cruel simply because cruelty had been aimed at her for years. She had not won because a powerful man rescued her. She had won because she walked out of a house that was slowly killing her spirit, chose uncertainty over contempt, and discovered that the very qualities the world dismissed as weakness were the ones that ultimately proved unbreakable. Not every ending arrives with the sound of applause. Some arrive quietly, like the first light of morning after the longest night. And the people who endure that darkness without losing who they are do not merely survive, they become the dawn itself.